recently we've seen how to draw a simple tic-tac-toe field, and with our new kind of skills and knowledge, let's try to apply this very practically, and let's try to expand our tic-tac-toe example a little bit. So what we're going to try to do in this tutorial is that we're going to try to create a tic-tac-toe game where we ask two users for input, and every time we print the tic-tac-toe field to the screen, and each turn a user can put in the field where they want to put their kind of cross or their circle. So we're not gonna really go into checking for winning and all that stuff yet, because that's gonna take a while, and that would be a very, very intricate example. But we're gonna go and take it as far as printing the final fields after the user has put in an input, and after that, it's really just adding extra if cases and extra checks. But let's just go through it once. Let's see how far we get, and then yeah, we'll kind of sum up at the end. So the first thing that we want to do is, since we're going to be drawing this field a lot, we actually want to create a function that we can call to draw our field. So what we want to do is we want to define a function, and we'll just call this function draw field. And so we define a function using the def keyword to indicate that we're going to define a function. Our function name is going to be draw field, and then we're going to open and close the brackets to indicate that we're going to have some input here. And yeah, so right now let's just kind of leave the input empty. We're going to change this later, but in here we're just going to draw our field. Now we've already pretty much gone over this example in one of the earlier videos where we've drawn the field. It's just that now we're putting it inside of a function. So if you remember earlier, we used two for loops and some if statements to draw the field, but now we're just going to put this all inside a function. So we'll go through this a little bit quicker. We'll still explain everything as we go, but if you want to see this part of the draw field again, I would recommend you go back to that video where we just used for loops and if statements to draw the field, to kind of better understand what exactly is happening. But yeah, so let's just kind of go through it again. And so if you remember, let's just draw our tic-tac-toe field up here. So we start with a space, and then we have a vertical line and another space and a vertical line and another space, and then our next line is going to be our horizontal separators, so we'll have 5 of those there, and then our third line is going to be a space and a vertical line and a space and a vertical line and another space, and then our fourth line is going to be 5 horizontal separators again, and then our final line is just going to be a space and a vertical line and a space and a vertical line and a space again. So this is how our tic-tac-toe field is going to look like. These vertical lines here are vertical separators, these horizontal lines are our horizontal separators, and each of these spaces are fields where the users can put in their values. Yeah, and so we'll just make a range function, and we're going to start counting at 0 rather than at 1, so we'll go 0, and then let's just add some space here so that it's not confusing. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these numbers are the numbers that correspond to these rows. So rows 0, 2, and 4 are the rows that have the space, vertical line, space, vertical line, space. And rows 1 and 3 are the ones that have the 5 horizontal dashes, or what we're going to use it for is being the horizontal separators. So these are just going to be the lines of our field, just like we've had before. So let's start off with our for loop. And what we're going to do is we're just going to go for, and we want to create the rows. So we're going to go use the temporary variable row, and we're going to go in the range up to but not including 5, so that we get 5 numbers. These numbers are going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, because we go in a range starting at 0, which we got by not putting a starting value, going up to but not including 5. So we're going to get the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 for our temporary variable row. And so if we remember from before, we want to check if row, as we see here, if row is even, if it's an even row, we want to print this. So we want to print the space, vertical line, space, vertical line, space. And if it's an odd row, we want to print this horizontal separator. So to check if it's an even row, we want to check if we divide row by 2, do we get a remainder? So if we divide row by 2 and the remainder, and if we compare this remainder to 0, so if we divide row by 2 and the remainder is 0, that means row is even. Or that means 2 fits in perfectly into row. So for example, 0 divided by 2, we get no remainder. 2 divided by 2, we get no remainder. Since 2 fits in once perfectly into 2, 4 divided by 2, we get no remainder. Since 2 fits in twice perfectly into 4, 1 divided by 2, we get a remainder of 1. Since we have this one remainder, and 3 divided by 2, 2 fits in once perfectly into 3, and then we get 1 divided by 2, which gives us a remainder of 1. So if our remainder is 0, or if we have an even number, then what we're going to do is we're going to print this line here. And so let's just add a comment here. Print writing lines. So we'll just call it this. So this, and we'll add the code here in a second. And else, so if row is not even, or if it's not perfectly divisible by 2, we're just going to print out 5 horizontal dashes, like this. So if row is 1 or 3, we're just going to print out these horizontal dashes. So let's go back to this if statement here. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to loop through, and we're just going to print this. If we remember from last time, we printed the space and the horizontal, the vertical line individually rather than printing it all at once. So we used another for loop, and we looped through column by column. So for column in range, and let's also just stick with 5, so going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So if we number that, we get 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are the columns that we have. So this is column 0, this is column 1, column 2, column 3, and column 4. So we see column 0, 2, and 4 actually correspond to the spaces, the writable spaces, and columns 1 and 3 correspond to the vertical lines, so the vertical separators. So here we're going to take on the values again, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is columns of values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And once again here we're going to check if our column is even. So if we divide column by 2 and we look at the remainder, so if we divide column by 2, and if the remainder of dividing column by 2 is 0, so if column is even, so 0, 2, 4 gives us a remainder of 0 if we divide by 2, what we're going to do is we're going to print a space. Now, remember I said we're going through this a little bit quicker because we already covered this in an earlier video and we don't want to kind of repeat all of this. So if this is a little bit too fast or you want to go over it again, I would recommend going back to that video, checking it out, really going through what we're doing. But this is just kind of a short recap session for printing this field. And if our column is not divisible by 2, we want to print out, or else we want to print out, the vertical line. And now we also remember that we need to put in the space, we need to have spaces here, or we need to have no separation so that we stay on the same line. So we need to change our end, and instead of putting a new line, we just want to stay on the same line and not add any extra special separation. We also need to change the end here to be no extra separation, just kind of continue where we left off. And we also need the special case to check, or rather we need to say if our column is not the final value, then we have no separation, but if it is the final value, then we need to print a new line. So if column is not equal to, and our final value is going to be 4 here, rather than 5, which we had in our last example, So if column is 4, what we need to do is we need to print a new line afterwards. But if it's 0 or 2, we want to stay on the same line so that we can have these vertical lines here. So if column is not equal to 4, so if column is 0 or 2, we want to continue writing on the same line. But else, if column is 4, we actually want to add a new line at the end so that we print this horizontal separator on a new line. So else, we would just want to print a space, and we're not going to change this extra end. We're just going to leave it as a new line. And so let's just take out this comment since we've completed this part now. And let's call this function once to make sure it works. So we'll call draw field. And if we call this function, we should just be able to draw this field here. Let's run this. Let's see what we get. Yeah, so we get what we expected, and what we also got last time. We got our tic-tac-toe field. So we loop through row by row, and each row we either print the writable parts or the horizontal separators. And if we print the writable parts, we actually go through it column by column. And here we print the space, and then we stay on the same line, and we print the new line, and then we print another space, and then we stay on the same line, and we print this horizontal bar again, just like we had here, and then we print a space, and now we actually print a new line too, so that the next time we print something, we end up on a new line, so that our horizontal separator is not on the same line anymore, but it's on a new line. So if we call our draw field function, this is actually what it does. It draws the current field for us. So yeah, cool. So now we have a function that we can call whenever we like, and every time we call it, we draw the current standing of the field. Okay, so now let's make it interesting and let's expand on this a little bit. So we'll use a similar tactic that we used before to make an infinite loop. So we'll do while true. So if you remember, using the while loop, so if we put in while true here, that's shorthand for writing while true is equal to true. So what we created here is a while loop, and in this while loop we put in the condition true, and this condition is shorthand for, or what actually happens here, it checks if true is equal to true. Oops. So it's only with one E, and since it's always going to be equal to true, we're just going to have an infinite loop. Now technically we don't need an infinite loop. We actually only need to go through it 9 times, so we could also make a for loop, for example, and just go through it 9 times because there can only be 9 input values. But let's just stick with an infinite loop right now, just so that we kind of get familiar with it and we know how to implement an infinite loop if we ever need one. So yeah, this while true here is just shorthand for writing while true is equal to true. So this is the same thing as this. So while true is the same thing as while checking if true is equal to true. But let's just leave this out because we don't really want to write that much. We want to write something that works in as little kind of characters as possible. We don't want to waste our time writing just a bunch of characters. We want to keep it short and to the point, but we want it to work nicely. So that's why we'll just use this shorthand here. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask for input. So we'll create a variable called move. Let's call it move. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for input. And then we want to ask them, so what do we want to know? We need to get the column and we need to get the row. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask the user for column and row input. So we're going to need to ask them for a column and a row. So let's ask them for a row first. Please enter the row. So first we ask the user to enter the row that they want to put. These are the rows that they want to put, that they want to move in. So we'll call this variable here move row. And so we'll use the conversion to an integer. So we'll type in the int, and we'll put this around the input. So what we're doing here is we've created a variable called moveRow, and inside of this we're going to store the row that the user wants to put their move into, and we're asking the user to enter a row, or enter the row, and when they enter it, we're going to try to convert it to an integer. So they're going to enter a number, hopefully, and we can of course check for this later, and we can make special cases, but let's just trust the user, and let's have them enter a number, and this number is going to be put in as a string through the input, or as a word, so it's going to be inside of these quotation marks. To convert it to a number or an integer, we're going to use the int keyword and then the open and close brackets, and we're going to convert the string or the word here that we get to an integer or a number. And we're going to save this in the move row. So that's the row that we want to place into. And now we want to ask for the column, so we'll have another variable called move column, and we'll just do the same thing as above. We ask for input, and we'll specify to the user, please enter the column, just like this. So we created a variable move column. We ask for input, please enter the column. But since our input is going to be in the form of a string, or that's the way it's going to be saved, so all the input we get is going to be kind of inside of these quotation marks, so it's going to be a word or a string. We have to try to convert it to a number or an integer again. So we have to use int around the input, and this is going to try to convert our word or a string that we get in here to a number or an integer, and it's going to save this in move column. So what we do is we ask the user first to input the row, then to input the column, and if possible, and we trust the user here that they enter an integer, we convert their input to integers, and we store it in the move row and in the move column variables. So cool. Now we've got the moves. So what do we do with this? How are we going to apply this? So the best thing that we can do to apply this is we have to kind of save this as a list. So there are two things actually that we need to do. One of them is we need to apply the move, and we need to save the move. So that's one thing. We need to apply and save the move. The second thing that we need to do is we need to check which player's turn it is. So do we put in an X or an O? So let's start off. Let's start off with the player. So we'll just start off with player is equal to 1. So we're creating a variable called player, and we're going to have it equal to the value 1. So this kind of means our player is going to have the value 1. So effectively, what we're reading is our player is currently player 1. And what we're going to do is we're going to check, say here, let's make on a new line, we're going to have an if statement. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to see which player's turn it is. So if player is equal to 1, so if player is 1, then we'll write this in a second, make move for player 1. So what we're doing is if our player variable here has the value 1, we want to make the move for player 1, else our move is going to be made for player 2. So make move for player 2. So what we're doing is we've created the player variable, and we've asked for the move of the player, that's the row and the column, and we've checked for, and then we're checking which player's turn it is, and we make the appropriate move. So how do we make a move? Well, the way we're going to make a move is we're going to save our playing field in a list. So what we want to do is we want to keep track of all of this in a list. So we'll make a list, or we'll create a variable, and inside of this variable we're going to save our playing status, so or our playing field, or our current field. So current field is what we'll call our variable, and our current field is going to be equal to a list. And inside of this list, we're just going to save, we're just going to have all of these values here. So inside of this list, we're going to have our first element, so element 1, then we're going to have element 2 and element 3. So we're going to have 3 elements, and we'll just have it so that each element corresponds to a column. So we want to have our current field, and we're going to have it be in rows, and each row, or in each kind of element, is going to correspond to a certain column. So element 1 is going to be column 1, element 2 is going to be column 2, element 3 is going to be column 3. So how would we do this? Well, element 1, for it to be column 1, it actually needs to save 3 values. So how are we going to save 3 values in one element? And so the way that we can do that is we can actually put another list inside of a list. So we've seen this earlier, and it may have been a bit confusing then why we would ever want to do that. But we're going to do it now, and we're going to see it's actually really, really practical in this case, because it really lets us keep track of our playing field in a kind of, it lets us kind of have a better picture of it. So the reason that we're doing all this formatting is because it helps us imagine it better. And so it'd probably be easier for us to imagine having a list of 3 elements, and each element corresponds to a row. We can kind of picture that nicely in our head. So we'll see that in a second. So let's create another list inside of our first element, and this first list is going to correspond to these 3 elements. So column 1, row 1, column 1, row 2, and column 1, row 3. So we're just going to have our standard values in here, and let's just have the standard values be space, so kind of empty. So our 3 elements are going to be 3 spaces, like this. So just like we've had up here, our current playing field, or our current row, or the current column that we've created is the first one, and our column value 1 for row 1 is just empty, like it is right here. Our column value for row 2 in the first column is also empty, and our column value for row 3 in our first column is also empty. So we're just trying to replicate this empty field in here. Now we'll do the same thing for element 2, because all of these values are empty too. So we'll put in another list here, and we'll create 3 elements. Each of these elements corresponds to a row, and they're all empty. So we'll put an empty element here, and then the comma to indicate the next element, and then an empty element, and then another empty element. So each of these elements here correspond to rows 1, 2, and 3, so 1, 2, and 3, in column 2, since they're the second element. And we'll do the same thing for element 3. So we'll create another list here, and we have to make sure that we actually close this list, not that we need 2 kind of ending square braces, not just 1. And here we'll have elements 1, 2, and 3 also just be spaces, just like we've had back here. So this may look extremely weird at first, but give it some time, try to look at it, try to understand what we're doing. So I'll explain it one more time, but it's really useful if you can kind of picture this in your head. So that the whole point of the way that we're formatting this is that it's easier for us to kind of imagine. So right now we've created kind of one line, but if we can imagine that we take this line here and we make it 2-dimensional, so that if we drag this kind of down like that, and this down like that, and this down like that, that we kind of get this playing field here, so that this value here, for example, corresponds to this value. The second value in the first element corresponds to this one. The third value in the first element corresponds to here. Then we move on to the second column, which is the second element in this big list. And so the first value corresponds to the first value here, the second value to the second one, the third one to the third one, and then our final element, our third element, the first value corresponds to the first one, the second one to the second one, and the third one to the third one. So what we've created is we've created a list, and in each of these elements we save the column. So this is column 1, column 2, column 3, and in each of these columns we've saved the elements row by row. So row 1, row 2, row 3 for column 1. Then column 2 here we again have row 1, row 2, and row 3. And for column 3 we have row 1, row 2, and row 3. So this is kind of a way that we're going to simulate our playing field, or the current status of our playing field. And we started off empty because our playing field is going to be empty, because no one's made a move yet. So let's make a move. Let's go back in here and let's have player 1 make a move, or let's put in the move for player 1. So what we want to do is we want to access our list, or we want to access our list here. We want to access our current field, and we're going to update it. We're going to access our current field, and we want to access the row and the column. So how are we going to access this? How do we want to how are we going to make sure that we're accessing the right element? Well, if we remember, in this big list, in the current field, this big list, each of these big elements here, each of these lists corresponds to one element, and these elements are the columns. So these three elements here are these three big lists, these three smaller lists here are each elements, and each of these are a column. So the first thing that we're going to access in this current field is the move column. So each of these small lists corresponds to one column. Column 1, column 2, and column 3. Column 1, column 2, and column 3. So that's why the first thing we need to access is the first column. And that's just because that's the way we're imagining it in our head. And if you want to imagine it differently, and if you want to go row by row, you can also do that. So you can say this is row 1, and then you can imagine this one being down here and saying this would be row 2. So if we kind of imagine moving this down here, we would have row 2. And if we imagine moving this down here, we would have row 3 below here. And then you can go with move row first. We're going to imagine it in our head that each of these we kind of turn by 90 degrees like this so that we get our 3 columns. And so that's the approach that we're going to take. And that's going to be your mental image of this list. But you can do it another way. But we'll just say that each of these is a column. And then, so we access the move column, and then we get one of these 3 elements, and each of these elements is a smaller list that has the row value. And so inside the column, we want to access the move row, so the corresponding row to this column. So first we access the column, because that's the way we're imagining it, and then we access the row, which is inside of each of these columns. So again, column 1, column 2, column 3, row 1, row 1, row 1, row 2, 2, 2, and row 3, 3, 3. Now, technically in terms of indices, it would be column 0, column 1, column 2, and row 0, row 0, row 0, row 1, row 1, row 1, row 2, row 2, row 2. So that's how it's like in terms of indices, but for practical terms, it's also just columns 1 through 3 and rows 1 through 3. So you just have to kind of also make that conversion in our head, that we have the first row is actually index 0, for example, just because we start counting at 0 in programming. But yeah, so we're going to update the column and the row in our current field, and we're going to assign a new value, and let's give player 1 the cross. So our current field is going to be a cross for player 1, and if we do the same thing down here for player 2, so we just access the same thing, we just do the exact same thing here. We want to access the column and the row. So in our current field, we access first the column, because that's the way we're imagining it in our head. If you want to do it row by row, that's fine. You just have to switch these two, and you kind of have to keep track of that. Yeah, you have to keep track of that up in here, but we'll just do it column by column. So we'll access the column. We'll imagine that each of these is one column, and then we want to access the row. And in here, we'll just put in a circle, or the O. So if it's player's one turn, we'll put in current field 1, or we'll put in an X, and if it's player 2 turn, we'll put in an O. And since we want to alternate players, if it's player's 1 turn and they make their move, now player is equal to 2. So in player 1, what do we do? Well, we have a move, and then we check if it's player's 1 turn, and if it is, they make the move, and now we change the player to be equal to 2. So now it's player 2 turn. And if it's player's 2 turn, they make the move, and now we change the player back to 1. So if it's player 1 turn, make a move, put in the cross, player 2, now it's player's 2 turn, and if it's player's 2 turn, we make the move, put in the O or the circle, now it's player's 1 turn. And since we're using the else statement here, if we execute this if, we're not going to go into this else, so we don't have to worry about having a player 2 here and then overwriting what we've had before. So if it's player 1, we'll execute all of this, and since we only have an else statement here, we'll skip it if we executed the if, and then we'll just kind of start the loop again from the beginning, and then player 2 can put in their values. So now we've done that, and we can run this, but we haven't really linked it to our board yet. So that's what we'll do next. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to link it to our board. But let's just run it once, see what we get now, and then yeah, let's move on from there. So we see here, please enter a row. We're going to have row 0. Please enter a column 1, and well, nothing happens now because we're not really doing anything else, but we're asking just for the row and the column, and then technically we've made a move, but we're not really seeing it yet. So maybe let's add some print functions to kind of see what we're getting. So let's stop our code, and at the very end, let's print the current field, and maybe in the beginning, let's print which player's turn it is. So player's turn, and here let's just put in the number of the player. So we'll use the comma, and then we're going to put in the player. So if you remember this from the input and output, so this is a special format. We have our string, our player's turn, and then we put a comma separator, and then we put in the variable player, which either has the values 1 or 2. And so we'll get player's turn, and let's put a space here so that we have some separation, and we'll get either 1 or 2. And so this is just, this comma allows us to actually put in an integer here, and the print function will just convert it all internally and make a big kind of string or a big word out of it. So yeah, and maybe in the beginning, let's just also print the current field before we even enter the loop, just so that we can see everything that's going on. And maybe let's also add a new line after each of these input requests, also just for formatting. So we're just making it a little bit neat right now. Let's run the code. We'll get some, and then we'll see what we get. So first we get the list, the empty list here. That is, if we make this really big. So first we get this empty list here, or the list that contains a bunch of spaces, which is our current field that we have here. So our current field is just these 3 elements containing the 3 small lists in this one big list. That's what we get from here. Then we enter the while loop. We print the player's turn. Currently player's turn is 1. Now we ask, please enter the row. Now we enter the row. Let's put in row 0. Now we ask for the column. Let's put in column 0, 2. And now we see we've updated our list. So player 1 has made the move column 0, so first element in this list, and row 0, so first element in this small list here. And now it's player's 2 turn. Let's say player wants to access row 2 in column 1. So column 1 is actually the index is actually the corresponding index. So 1 here actually corresponds to column 2, and 2 here in the row actually corresponds to row 3, if we think of it how we counted the rows before. But since we're dealing with indices rather than actual numbers, so we'll see here for column 1, so that will be the second element in the list. So this is column 0, which is the first element. This is column 1. And inside of column 1, we access row 2. So we've got row 0, row 1, and row 2. So we've seen that we've updated our list again, and we've put in player 2's turn, and we've put in the O here. And we see up here that it's player's 2 turn, and then we make the move, and now it's player 1's turn again. So yeah, let's stop our code. And so we've kind of put in this basic functionality of making the moves, but now the next thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to expand on this, and we're going to need to expand on it in such a way so that we can now kind of incorporate it here into the draw field. And we want to transfer our current field and the input to the draw field. So every time a player makes a move, we want to draw the field, and we want to see the updated version. So that's what we need to work on next.